This week's lecture talks about heredity and inheritance. Here's the learning objective. We're going to start with just an introduction to heredity. Genetics versus heredity. So genetics has to do with the study of all of the genetic material. That includes DNA, RNA, its structure, the genes, and everything that's involved with kind of the field of molecular biology. While heredity is talking about the passage of genes from parent to offspring. So with heredity, we're concerned about how these genes go from one individual down to their offspring. When we study genetics, we're looking at traits, and those traits can be inherited by many genes or by just one gene. So polygenic versus monogenic traits. A polygenic trait, if we break down the word, poly means many, genic is talking about genes. This is a trait that is inherited by multiple genes. In other words, multiple genes and the products of those genes will come together to create the trait. Hair color is a good example of a polygenic trait. There are lots of different shades of hair color, and there's many genes involved in the production of the hair color. Monogenic, mono means one, gene is talking about, or genic is talking about gene. So monogenic trait is inherited by one gene. An example of a monogenic trait would be horned or polled cows. Horned means that they have horns. Polled means that they don't. They either have horns or they don't. So they have it or not. Monogenic traits are going to be inherited by one gene. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of what makes up our genome and how we inherit genes specifically. Genotype versus phenotype. Now let's say that eye color was a monogenic trait, which it's not, but let's just pretend for this scenario. Now let's say we learned from last week's lecture that a human has 46 chromosomes. 23 came from mom. So chromosome 1, chromosome 2, all the way down to chromosome 23. And 23 chromosomes came from dad. Chromosome 1, chromosome 2, again all the way down to 23. Now let's say your mom has brown eyes and your dad has blue eyes. Are you going to have both brown and blue eyes? Likely not. Now let's say that the gene that controls eye color is on the first chromosome. So we have this region which controls eye color. Now on the same chromosome that was inherited by dad, that region would also contain information about eye color. But it's not going to be the exact type of eye color. Well, even though it's talking about eye color on chromosome 1 in that particular location, mom had the brown-eyed allele and dad had the blue-eyed allele. So what an allele is a form of a gene. So for example, you can have the brown-eyed allele or the blue-eyed allele. Now if we take it back to what is a gene, if you remember what a gene is, it's a segment of DNA that codes for a protein. In this case, the protein that's being produced is melanin, and melanin is a pigmented protein. So the more melanin that you have in the eye, the more brown the eye is going to look. And actually, having brown eyes is a dominant trait. A dominant trait is a trait that will mask the effects of a recessive trait or a recessive allele. So dominant is a trait that will hide a recessive trait, or the dominant allele will hide the recessive allele. So in the case of eye color here, we know that brown is dominant. And when we want to depict what an allele is so that we can keep track of this in genetics and heredity, we give it a one letter. So since we have brown, we'll give it, and blue, and they both start with B, we'll give it the letter B. So B, as a capital B, is going to be the dominant allele. And in this case, dominant is going to be brown. B, as a little b, is going to be the recessive allele. And in this case, it's going to be blue. Now, when we inherit these traits from our parents, we inherit one form of the gene, or one allele from our mom, and one allele from our dad. And together, the alleles that we have inherited constitute our genotype. So the genotype has to do with the alleles that are present in our genome. So if this human being was you, your genotype would be big B, little b. Because you got one dominant allele from your mom and one recessive allele from your dad. Phenotype is the physical characteristic that is expressed by the individual. So in this case, your phenotype would be brown eyes. Well, why would it be brown eyes? Because anytime you have even one dominant trait, one dominant allele present in your genotype, you will express the dominant phenotype. So your phenotype would be brown eyes. Now there's of course exceptions to everything that I'm talking about, but we're going to learn the most common scenario and the most likely scenario. So that's what we're going to focus on in this class. If this were specifically a genetics class, then yeah, we would talk about gene silencing and all the other things that can happen in order to create variations of phenotypes, and gene expression can be altered and all that type of stuff. But it's just a basic biology class, so we're just going to go through the most common scenario. So your genotype would be the alleles present in your genome, while your phenotype would be the physical characteristic that's expressed by the individual. Now let's say your mom had blue eyes and your dad had blue eyes. If both mom and dad give you the recessive allele, you would be little b, little b. Your genotype would be little b, little b. Your phenotype would be blue eyes. This is considered homozygous. So homozygous has to do with having two of the same types of alleles. In other words, so homo means the same, zygous is talking about what alleles are present in the developing zygote. So we have homozygous, that means that the alleles are present in the same form. So homozygous, in this example, both mom and dad gave you the blue-eyed gene, or blue-eyed allele. This is homozygous recessive because it's lowercase, lowercase, and we know that blue-eyed allele is a recessive trait. We can also have homozygous dominant. If both mom and dad gave you the blue-eyed gene, the brown-eyed allele, then you would get one big B and another big B, and that would be considered homozygous dominant. So those are the possibilities, but the one that we came up with originally was this big B, little b. That is considered heterozygous. Hetero means different, so we're talking about different alleles that are inherited. Heterozygous, if it's for a recessive trait and talking about a gene that's inherited recessively, sometimes we can call them carriers. Sometimes we can call them hybrids. In lab, you're going to be going through a bunch of different examples of heredity, and you may see these terms carrier or hybrid, or even on a quiz question or exam question, you may come in contact with these two words. So know that a carrier or a hybrid is a heterozygote. The heterozygote will express the dominant trait if this is a gene that's inherited recessively, or that inherited by recessive inheritance, because any presence of a dominant allele means that it will automatically mask the effects of the recessive allele. Punnett squares. Punnett squares are used to estimate the probability of offspring. What we do with a Punnett square is we look at the genotypes of the parents and estimate the likelihood that they're going to have children with particular traits, or they're going to have offspring with particular traits. Let's start with a simple example that's talking about the inheritance of a recessive trait. So we have fur color. So if we are talking about a random species of animal, let's say that brown fur is dominant, white fur is recessive. Now in the problem, we're going to say we mate a brown carrier with a white individual. What is the probability of having white offspring? So first we have to determine the genotypes of the parents. We're mating a brown carrier. Now if brown is dominant, and we use the letter B for the fur color trait, since they're a carrier, we would have big B, little b. And we're mating that with a white individual. So white is recessive, which means that they would have to have the little b, little b. So now we make a tic-tac-toe board. And we're going to separate the alleles of the parents here. So dad can, if we assume that the first one is a male, dad can give either a big B or a little b, but mom can only give a little b or a little b. So now we're going to carry these in. So we carry the big B down and the little b over. The little b down and the little b over. Big B down and little b over, and little b, little b. On the outside here, we have parents. And on the inside, we have the probability of the offspring. Now we look at what genotype these offspring are. Half of them are carriers. So this means that 50% are brown carriers. Half of them are white. They express the recessive traits. So to answer this question, we would say that there is a 50% chance that these parents will have offspring, or that there is a likelihood that 50% of their offspring will be white in color. So this doesn't mean that if they had 4 children, 4 babies, baby 1, 2, 3, 4, that 2 of them would for sure be white. This means that if they had 100 babies, about 50% of them would be white. So it's just a probability. There is a chance, although unlikely, that this couple could mate and have 100% brown children. The more children they have, the more likelihood we're going to achieve this 50-50%. So we're going to try one more example. Let's say PKD, polycystic kidney disease, can be inherited either dominantly or recessively. And we're going to talk about the recessive form. And we're going to use the letter D because D looks much different whether it's a capital versus a lowercase letter. So if they have it, they are going to be recessive. If they don't, they can either be big D, or big D, little d. So let's say that we mate a PKD homozygote with someone with PKD. What is the likelihood that their children will have polycystic kidney disease? Well, we do Punnett square here, and we look at the alleles. Now we said they're homozygous dominant, which means they do not have the disease, and then we made them with an individual that has the disease. So when we break apart mom versus dad, we're going to carry these in. And we look at the offspring here. None of these offspring are little d, little d. So it is safe for these two to mate and have children because none of their offspring will be affected by the disease. But let's say that this was dominantly inherited. If it's a dominantly inherited trait, this means that if you have it, all you need is one capital letter. If you don't, you have the little d, little d. Let me try to fix this a little bit. So now in this situation, So now we have a PKD hybrid. This means that they have the disease because this is now dominantly inherited, and they're a hybrid, which means that they have a big D, a little d. Mate's an unaffected individual, so they're going to be little d, little d. What is the probability of them having offspring with PKD? Let's put our genes in here, or our alleles, big D, little d, little d, little d. And we're going to go through here. Now let's look at the offspring. If you have it, all you need is one capital D. So about 50% chance that their children will have this disease. This is actually the case of my friend Michelle. So she has the dominant form. She's a carrier. One of her parents had it, the other parent didn't. So she ended up having the dominant form here. And the dominant form is much better to get. With something like polycystic kidney disease, you get all these cysts that accumulate in the kidneys, and these cysts can become really large. They frequently get infected, and they decrease the function of the kidneys. And one of the main functions of the kidneys is to reabsorb or suck back up the nutrients that we need to stay in the body so that they're not lost in the urine. So she started losing a lot of weight, had frequent UTIs, and went to the doctor, and they discovered all of these cysts in her kidneys. And this actually happened when she was about 16 years old. And I went to numerous doctor's appointments with her to figure out what was going on with her. But came down to it, and they discovered that she had the polycystic kidney disease, and she was kind of considering having children. And they laid this out for her. They're like, well, you are the dominant form, which means all your children need is one capital letter. They need the dominant form of the gene, and they will have the disease. So looking at this, if she were to find an individual and mate with an individual that did not have the disease, that was lowercase, lowercase, there's a 50% chance that her children would be born with this disease. So she decided to not have children. But learning about heredity can help us make decisions about whether or not two individuals should have children, or whether other options should be explored for them to be able to have children. Now, the main difference I want to point out here is if we go back to the recessive form, if you are inheriting something recessively, that means in order to have the disease, you would have to have two recessive letters. But if you are inheriting something that's a dominant allele, that's expressed dominantly and inherited dominantly, then all you need is one capital letter in order to have the disease. In dominant inheritance, when we start looking at the pedigrees later on, many people in the family tend to be affected. While in recessive inheritance, it's usually much fewer people that are affected.